All right, hi, this is Pat with Racket Stringing Tips, and today we have, of course, we have Brad on, and then we have our special guest, Jon Sharpe, aka String Doctor, over in the UK, and so he's been willing to be a guest today, and so we really want to learn more about what he does, and I think we're also going to be introduced to squash, and that's one thing that I've been wanting to get into a little bit more because I don't really know anything about the sport of squash or stringing squash rackets. And so hopefully we'll be able to get some good input and also learn some stuff that's going to be valuable here. So yeah, we'll start off with Jon, and I know there's articles out there about what you do, and I actually found one that got me kind of a little bit of history about what you do, and this sounds like it's from a squash magazine called squashmad.com, and you could learn all about Jon there, and you know, I think a lot of your history is not so much different than many of us. You know, we early on we learned strings somewhere along the line, either by playing, breaking a lot of strings, and going, okay, how can I take care of this myself? At first, you're going to go to somebody else to string your rackets, but at some point you're like, well, I want to play with this. I want to learn how to do this, and I want to try different things. I want to save some money, and so you get involved in stringing on your own, and then somewhere along the line you're like, other people ask you about it, and so then you start getting into stringing for others, and it just becomes part of your routine, and you just fall in love with it, or not. Some people just do it as a must do, but yeah, so that's kind of, I don't know, you're over in the UK. It sounds like you are southwest of England is what I read from the article. It sounds like if you're still there. And in 2013, you started the String Doctor, so you kind of took it to that next level. And it sounds like you string both badminton, squash, and tennis rackets. So I don't know. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm originally from South Wales, so Wales on the border of England, and I moved to the southwest of England about 9.5, 10 years ago to be closer to my family who had relocated. We had 2 small children at the time, now 3 children, and where I live, I guess it's kind of like the California of the UK. Lots of beaches. The weather's generally a little bit better, but the weather's never great in the UK, is it?
Less rain, maybe a little less rain there. Is that?
It's supposed to be, yeah.
It seems like with Wimbledon, that's always the thing. Every time I've gone over there several times, and it's always raining. It's always raining. So
yeah, it rains in the UK when you don't want it to. We don't really have seasons like you guys do. So I moved to the southwest of England 9 years ago, and couldn't find a stringer. I'd strung for myself a few occasions. I think 1997 I first started stringing, and that was when I was at university on a friend's machine who lent me his machine because I used to break strings a lot. I didn't really know what I was doing back then. I just had the basics of it, and I had some good strings to put in the racket, and he would be there to tell me if I'd done things incorrectly. But then back in 2013, when I moved, I just couldn't find a stringer that could string the rackets how I wanted. And I've always been really into my strings. I was a pretty reasonable squash player. And my son was at the time 6-7 years of age and really getting into squash. And a couple of years later, he started playing in the national team as well. So at a very junior age, which he still does. So I knew that at some stage I was going to need to start stringing rackets for myself because I couldn't find a good stringer, and also for my son as well, which is probably the main reason why I got into stringing and how a lot of people do it in the first place. And for me, it was quite easy, just because I really like strings. I really like rackets. I'm a bit of a geek, a bit of a nerd when it comes to strings anyway. And for me to read up and to look at videos and speak to people, one of my good friends is a guy called Nick Down, who is probably the top squash stringer in the world, and he was my mentor. He took me through all of my courses quite a few years ago, and I've known him for a long period of time. So he's been kind of pivotal over the last 10 years in helping me, drive me forward, and I string at tournaments with him now as well. So that's, I guess, just a bit of background into myself.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned him in that article that I read over at that squashmad.com. And so as far as squash, then how do the tournaments differ at squash tournaments from tennis tournaments? And I guess what is the tour like as far as for squash?
Yeah, so I think the squash tour is quite similar to the tennis tour, where you have players going all over the world to America. I mean, America's a big place, so there's 3 or 4 big tournaments kicking off in America at the moment. So, the squash tour is similar. It's all over the place, from America to Australia to Egypt is huge. So the Egyptian squash game is the biggest in the world at the moment. They dominate world squash. And I think where it differs from a stringing perspective is that with squash, you have 1 or 2 stringers, normally two good stringers at a major tournament, sometimes only 1. And we will be given rackets when the strings break, as opposed to in tennis. A tennis player will hand a stringer, one of up to 25 stringers, will hand a stringer a racket, 7 or 8 rackets in the morning that they need for their match. And that stringer will have 2 or 3 hours to turn around those rackets, because the temperature may have changed. There may be more sun on the court than there was previously, or they've just decided that they need to get more pop in their game because they're playing against somebody that likes to slow the ball down a bit. So that's where tennis and squash differ very much. Squash players will say, right, I want 26 or 27 pounds tension in my rackets. They'll hand you 3 or 4 rackets, normally the week before a tournament, so they can wear them in a bit. And then they'll normally make 3 or 4 rackets last for a week, but there'll be tournament stringers on hand. So if any strings break, they then get replaced. But it's very, very the squash stringing world is very, very different from tennis.
Wow. So how many? So like as an example, there, when you're talking about maybe 1 to 2 stringers, I guess it's always good to have a backup, right?
Yeah.
Even if the person's just sitting there, you want to have an extra person. But so how many players would be in a tournament like that? Like, let's say, because in a Grand Slam, you're going to have 128 or something like that would be a draw. And for something like that, in a Grand Slam, that's a 2-week tournament, you might have 12 to 15 stringers. So just to give that perspective. So for that kind of a level of or amount of players, is that what you're saying would be the two stringers?
Yeah, you'll normally not have that many players in a squash tournament, just because there's quite a big disparity between the top 32, for example, and those afterwards. I mean, I think once you get beyond 150 the top 150 squash players in the world, probably on men's and the women's tour, then the level does drop off significantly. Whereas in tennis, you might get somebody ranked 120 in the world that could upset the world number 1 on any given day. I mean, you look at Raducanu winning the US Open.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was crazy. That was
right.
So somebody coming from qualifiers to win it. That just wouldn't happen in squash.
Oh.
So you tend to find that sometimes you have qualifiers, but the main draw is normally 32, sometimes 64, but normally 32, and it's played over the course of a week. So normally, if a player turns up with 6 rackets, that should last them the week with a couple of restrings.
Okay, so let's say that size tournament for a week. How many rackets on average would you string during that week? The whole tournament. For
normally between, I'd say you're looking at between 20 and 30 rackets per day. So fairly similar numbers to what a stringer would string at a Grand Slam tournament. I don't think many stringers would string more than 20 or 30 rackets in a day if they're doing it properly. So a similar level for 1 stringer, but obviously that string is still being put through their paces a lot. And I think the difference in squash as well is that the strings won't break quite as easily in squash. They're all multifilament, so all the top players will use multifilament strings, whereas in tennis it's generally poly with gut or
Well,
with
that makes it
perhaps
worth that work makes it worth stringing right there. I mean, going to a tournament to string right there because you're stringing multi. It's a lot easier on you as well as a stringer. It's a little more a little more relaxing because if you get a bunch of multifilament or natural gut with tennis, you're just like, yes, all right, I get a break, you know.
yeah.
But because poly, just doing racket after racket, and of course the rackets though probably have tighter patterns because they're smaller, right?
Yeah, for sure. And although multi-filament string is a lot easier on the fingers than poly, especially if you're using like Allia Power Rough or Black or Dunlop Black Widow or something which is going to cut your fingers up. Multi-filament strings are nice, but as you said, the racket heads are smaller, the patterns are a lot tighter, and the thing with squash is that most rackets that you string, although some follow similar lines in the pattern, I could string 20 rackets in a day and 10 of them might have completely different string patterns. So
it's almost like racquetball. It's almost like racquetball rackets, right? A lot of them go through the throat or
yeah. So very, very similar in squash. So racquetball rackets, most of them have most of the patterns on a racquetball racket, apart from the ones that go through the handle, they've actually come from squash designs. So most of them come from, so the fan shape racket is really common, where you have the shed grommets at the bottom and you'll have the fans coming up. Heads make squash rackets which are adaptive fan patterns, where you can have it in a regular pattern or you can have the fan pattern that shoots off. So learning what to do and alternating the sides. Prince power rings are very common rackets in squash. Not always the easiest for some people to string. For me, I love them because they're a bit different, and once you learn how to do it, they're not too bad. But you've got to learn as a pro stringer, as a tournament stringer, you've got to learn an awful lot of different styles, a lot of different ways of doing
I might
things.
be sitting there for an hour trying to figure this thing out. I'll be looking at my book trying to figure this thing out. I remember starting out with racquetball rackets and I'd get a few of those, and yeah, it's challenging. It's going to take you a little bit of time, but so do you enjoy stringing at, because it sounds like you've strung at both types of tournaments, both tennis and squash. Which do you prefer to string at?
So squash is my main thing. So I do a lot of tennis stringing from home. I have players send me their rackets. I have a few young professional players and some of the top under 19 players in the UK that will give me their rackets to string at the moment. Squash, I think because I'm probably more into the game of squash and I'm a bit better known in the squash world, I can stand and talk to the players. And I guess that's another different thing with squash to tennis. The stringers, the volunteers, even the crowd sometimes are probably a lot closer to the squash players than they may be in tennis. I mean, you could be a stringer at a Grand Slam tournament in tennis and you might only actually have a conversation with a professional tennis player on a few occasions, mainly because you'd be very busy, but also because you just may not overlap each other and you're in a different building. With squash, I mean, the article which you saw, which you looked at in Squash Mad, that was me with a machine, and I was in the hall on the entrance to the squash club in Birmingham in the Midlands, where you had some of the top players in the world playing in, and they had to walk past me to go anywhere, to go to Starbucks or to go to the toilet or to go out the building. So I knew most of them anyway, and I strung for a few of them, and I'd have a coffee with them. I'd talk to them, have a sandwich with them. You couldn't necessarily do that in tennis. So from that perspective, I really love squash for that. I string for quite a few players who will just send their rackets to me to string before tournaments. I'm sure he won't mind me saying it. Mohammed Al-Shabagi, who is, I guess, squash's equivalent of Roger Federer over the last decade. He's currently world number 3, but he has been number 1 as recently as about 6 months ago. He sends me his rackets to string. I string them before tournaments. He's out in the US at the moment. And I talk to him on the phone. He sends me text messages, and he sends my son rackets saying happy birthday on
Oh,
them,
that's
which you can
cool.
pin on his
Oh,
wall.
I bet, yeah, I bet he appreciates that. That's nice.
Yeah, cool. And it's just it's a nice touch. It's something which is really good to see. And I guess Ron, who you mentioned before in the tennis world, I think he probably has a fairly similar relationship with some of his players that he strings for.
Yeah.
And that's something which I really like about squash. I don't think in the tennis world I'm at that level. I'm sure I could go to a Grand Slam and string as competently as most stringers. I'd like to think I could anyway. I'll probably get a bit tired after a few days because those guys really grind it for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But I'm just a bit better known in the squash world, I guess.
Oh yeah, and you know, I guess a comparison on the tennis side to that would be some of the smaller tournaments, some of the smaller ATP and WTA tournaments, not the top, 250 or whatever, some of the lower tiered ones. Those are ones where you can have a little bit more of that, because I remember when I used to live in Southern California and I would string at some of the smaller tournaments that they had there, the WTA and one specifically, you'd have the same players. Like that was the day when Lindsay Davenport and of course a lot of other top players at that time. And so
Yeah.
I'd see them at some of the same tournaments and be able to have conversations with them and stuff. And just because they knew you from being in Southern California and that's where they live and stringing at their club and so forth. So you do build a little bit of that kind of local relationship with maybe some players that might be in your local area that you tend to see at a bunch of the tournaments as you start stringing at more tournaments and stuff. But once you get at that Grand Slam, many times you just don't have that opportunity because you're just one in a dozen people standing way back, and you're not even handling the rackets when they come in because they have a system that they go through as far as taking rackets in and so forth. So you really don't have a lot of that opportunity unless you run into them like in eating a meal in the lunchroom or in the players' lounge or something like that, if you can have access to that. But yeah, it sounds like squash is fun in some aspects, and I'm gonna have to get up to speed on some of that. But I guess a question that I had too is, so what would you tell somebody who wanted to get into stringing squash rackets and who was maybe interested in that sport? What would you tell them would be like the way to go, first steps?
Yeah, I think first of all I would suggest the good thing with squash is that you have two absolute superpowers in string manufacturers in squash, so that makes life a lot easier. So you have Technifiber, who are probably the number one at the moment, and then you have Ashaway, a US company who you'll most likely know. They do tennis strings as well. Technifiber and Ashaway are probably the two most popularly used string companies in world squash, accounting for about 80 to 85% of all strings used on the Pro Tour, which is big. So that's one really good thing. And they have two or three, well, Technifiber has three major product lines, and Ashaway probably 4 or 5 major product lines. So the first thing I would say is learn those, because if you learn them, if you stock them, if you know the properties of those strings, then you cannot go wrong, because most good players will use either Technifiber or Ashaway. What has happened over the last 5 years or so is that some of the big companies like Head, Wilson have tried it, but certainly Head, a squash mate called Unsquashable, which is pretty big right now. They're all making their own strings. Dunlop as well. They all make their own strings, and they really try to push their pros and their sponsored players to use their strings as well. I'm lucky. I'm sponsored by Technifiber, and my son's sponsored by Technifiber as well.
Oh,
so
nice.
We have to use the strings that we love. So it's not too much of a hardship for us. We don't have to be sneaky. So the first thing, strings. Learn the strings. Second thing is learn the patterns. Now, there are probably 4 or 5 major types of string pattern within squash. So you have the powering type pattern, and there's 3 or 4 manufacturers now that use the powering. So that's where you've got the loop. They have Prince 2 powering in tennis as well. So that's where you've got the loop at the end of the throat where the string wraps around. That's quite common. 3 or 4 companies will have rackets with that style on it. So learn that one. The fan shape patterns, learn those patterns. That's one of the most frequently asked questions, because you skip holes at the head, you skip grommets at the head rather, at different places than you'd imagine. So sometimes the second string going up might go through the 5th or 6th grommet, whereas you normally go through the 2nd or maybe even the 3rd. So learn those patterns. I think also learning somebody's style of play. So where squash is probably quite similar to tennis is that although in squash you don't tend to have spin so much as in tennis, a tennis backhand is probably the old-fashioned kind of Steffi Graf popularized backhand, where you slice through it, where you cut through the tennis ball. That's quite similar to forehand and backhand in squash, where you cut on the ball. But certain players will put more cut on the ball, more spin on or slice on the ball than others in squash, and those players won't get on very well normally with ashaway strings, because they'll burn through them really, really quickly. But you'll also have some players who will use Technofiber strings and they'll hit a lot flatter, but they'll do miss hits around the frame of the racket if they're using Technofiber. So it's knowing the style of a player and why they keep breaking strings. Do they need to change string manufacturer? Do they need to change tension to stop the strings from moving so much? So it's really the kind of the intricate things in squash. And it's very similar to tennis in a way. You know, if you're doing a hybrid setup in tennis and you're using an angled, like Silinco Hyper G, for example, you know, you're using an angled string that's quite sharp with a very soft multifilament, you know that multifilament's going to be cut up in a very short space of time. So you advise your players, your clients, on what string to use. It's very similar in squash. So I think knowing the rackets, knowing the patterns, knowing the string types, and also understanding the style of player as well, and not being afraid to ask. So if you're thinking of getting into squash stringing, not being afraid to ask the people that should know what they're doing. Certainly, I've learned a lot of what I know either through trying to find out myself, because I think trial and error is often the best way to learn things, but also asking people who I consider friends and mentors.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about, like, so do you actually do a lot of hybriding? Because I understand that you might not. I mean, do you mostly just do one-piece stringing?
No, so in squash, hybrid stringing, unless you're doing it for fun or trying to make interesting colours, it just doesn't happen. It has happened, and there are a few companies that have tried to do hybrid stringing, but there's little point. And I think the way in which technically squash works is very different from tennis. When you have a much smaller string bed, it's not like in tennis where you know that the main strings in a tennis racket will account for 80% of the playability of the ball on the strings, and you might want to use multifilament to just soften it up a little bit, or use it the other way around. In squash, the head shapes, largely speaking, they're a lot smaller, and that sweet spot is where all of the ball is hit. So it's not going to really change a great deal, whereas in tennis it will do. But there are companies in the past. I mean, Caracal, who you may know Caracal because they're a really good manufacturer of grips, but they're also quite big in squash for rackets now. They sponsor a lot of pros. They, about 20 years ago, developed a hybrid string, which was the main string was multifilament and the cross string was nickel. And yeah, that was about the most uncomfortable string I've ever used in my life. And I was sponsored by them at the time, so they would throw me this stuff. But
so it must be kind of like a Kevlar or something, just unplayable.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, it was on a different level. I mean, it was like playing with guitar strings.
Oh wow. Well,
you know,
oh yeah, go ahead.
Do you want to jump in real quick? So Pat, I'm trying to remember. So about 3-4 weeks ago, Pat and I participated in the ERSA virtual symposium. I don't know if you were you on that at all, John? Or
so I was invited because I'm ERSA qualified myself, as a Master Pro stringer. But unfortunately, we had family commitments that I think I was actually away at a tournament. My son was playing in a tournament that weekend as well. So it was, but they're always brilliant though.
It was great. And one of the guests was your buddy, I guess, Nick Down. So I participated in his virtual event. And I don't know if Pat, if you were at that one, or it might have been in the middle of the night in Hawaii, but he was the squash stringer.
Yeah, I haven't watched that one yet. I still need to watch those.
That was very good. And we got to talk afterwards. So I got to ask him a question. And the question I asked him, and I guess I'll present it to you also, is I said, as a tennis stringer, how am I most likely to screw up when I string my first squash racket? And he kind of laughed, and he said they're very, very similar, and most likely you won't screw up if you've got a handle on stringing tennis rackets, as long as you've got the pattern down and you mount it correctly and set the tension correctly. But would you say that's true for the most part? Now, he did admit to one mistake, which was kind of interesting, that he was having an issue where a couple rackets cracked because he didn't have the 9 and 11 o'clock mounts kind of up high enough toward the top, and so there was too much pressure at the top. I don't know if you're familiar with that or what he would have been talking about there.
So I mean, Nick is somebody who I know really, really well. I would completely agree with what he said. I think a competent tennis stringer like yourselves, you will know what looks right and what doesn't look right. So when you're stringing the mains of a tennis racket or the mains of a squash racket, for the average string pattern, you'll know if you've gone through the right grommet or the wrong grommet. It doesn't differ too much from that. Even if it's a totally different shaped head, you will generally speaking know what you're doing with that. I know Nick's machine that he's using at the moment, I think he's using an Ashaway machine, which is pretty decent, but he would have had probably a machine at some point in the past which may not have had the right kind of clamps on it. So you will have, I mean, you probably see in the background, I've got a Biardo in the back there, which is one of the new light ones, which is perfect for squash, badminton, racquetball, and obviously for tennis as well, because it's got the adjustable posts in it. So it's really good for doing all of those. But it used to be one size fits all with stringing machines. So those are things, I guess, to look out for. And it might be that if you've got a machine that's been designed purely for tennis that might be 20 years old, 20 years plus old, then they may not be too kind on the squash rackets either.
Where do you get all your pattern information? Like, I know we can go to the USRSA website, rackettech.com, or the manufacturers, but where do you find most of pattern help? If I suppose you don't need it anymore, but someone like Pat and I, if we get into squash stringing, where will we find pattern information?
So it's a really good question, actually, because it's the question I get asked more than anything. People cannot find information about squash rackets. It's really hard to find. Prints generally were pretty good. US company, certainly used to be anyway. So they were pretty hot with all the stringing patterns for most of their rackets. Wilson were okay, but most manufacturers, they don't have too many resources. So one thing which I've done in the last 12 months is set up a YouTube channel where I give demonstrations on how to string different types of rackets, normally the more tricky rackets. So I guess it's people like me. So in my early stages of stringing, I would have gone to a stringer that had been on the scene for a while. They'd seen every different type of racket. So Nick was my kind of go-to guy. So if there was a racket which I hadn't strung before, which I thought was a bit different and maybe needed some more attention, I would go to somebody like Nick to get that advice if I couldn't find it first. So I'd always try to find the resources first, but if I couldn't find them, then I would go and ask. And I probably get 2 or 3 inquiries a day from people who are starting their journey in stringing and need help with either basic or very complicated rackets. I'm a big believer, though, that I think if you're a good stringer, if you're a competent stringer, well, I mentioned trial by error before, but I think sometimes figuring it out yourself is a good way to do it. And using the same rules that you would have in tennis as in squash, which would be to try to make the loops outside of the racket as short as possible. So you're not leaving, you're not having these 10-centimeter loops on the outside of the rackets, which you get with some frames. So that's something which definitely I would apply from tennis, because often rackets from the manufacturer will be strung completely incorrectly in squash, where you'll have the crosses going from throat to head just because it's easier. Whereas that should never happen. And there are still quite a lot of squash players that don't see the benefit of stringing from the head to the throat in squash. And that's something which I'll never ever string a squash racket from throat to head, because I know, especially from tennis, that it's just not the thing to do. You just don't do it. So often I will work things out for myself as to what's going to be the best thing to do for a racket. And there are a few videos which I've posted with racquetball rackets, funnily enough, which can be a bit of a pain, where I've actually just designed off the hoof a completely new way of stringing a racket, just because the rackets from the manufacturer aren't set up particularly well for the easiest stringing pattern. So I've worked out different ways of doing things.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm going to make sure that I will link to your when I get this video all edited and everything. I'll make sure I link to your YouTube channel as well. So, because I remember doing that with some tennis rackets in the past too, where sometimes there would be just so much string on the outside where you're just going, there's got to be a better hole, but you have to think about that ahead of time, because you're either going to have to make the hole a little bit bigger, change your pattern up. We used to do things like, you'd leave a string, you'd go to the outside main, then you go back in one main, and then you go and tie off, because that way you have the cleanest looking areas outside of the racket, because that's just as important, because, where are you going to lose tension? Those kind of places. So, and also, if it's an area where you potentially could be scraping the racket on things, it could potentially damage the string there as well. So just from hits. But
yeah, and that's a really good point actually, Pat, because in squash, unlike tennis, in squash, probably 10% of all shots, maybe even 20-30% of all shots in squash, the outside of the frame is exposed to the wall all the time. In squash, in America, they call it going up and down the rails, which going up and down the wall. So a good squash shot, very much like tennis, will be going down the line and trying to get as wide as possible to make it more difficult for the other player to hit, so that the frame of the racket or the head is constantly scraping against the wall. So that's one of the main reasons for people breaking strings in squash, is the strings being exposed on the outside. So the less string on the outside of a racket you've got, the better, really. And also it's about things like bumper maintenance and things. I replace bumpers in squash rackets because they wear out to the frame. That doesn't happen quite so much in tennis, really. I think people tend to replace their rackets before they do the bumpers.
Do they use head tape in squash, or is that unheard of? That doesn't really help.
No, they use head tape. I think most pros don't. So most of the top end players would rather not use it, just because it adds a bit more friction on the wall. So a lot of squash players, a lot of the professional players will actually shave the bumper strip off their squash rackets. So you can actually, and I've been testing a few rackets for Technofiber and other manufacturers where they don't actually use a bumper strip. They're trialing things because it just adds weight onto the end of a racket. And in squash, weight is everything. Manufacturers try to reduce the weight of the racket, but make the balance right. So balance and weight in squash is really, really important, because it's a very, very dynamic sport. If you ever watch any professional squash, that racket is in the air all the time. The players are constantly looking to volley the ball, to take the ball as early as they can, a bit like in badminton. So the less weight you have on the racket, the better. So things like adding head tape, a lot of club players will use it. Because they don't want to spend what would be probably $15 on a new bumper strip.
Yeah. It's like that in tennis too. I mean, you're not going to see head tape on at a pro tournament very often, because it does also add that weight and so forth. Yeah, seems about the same. But that's interesting. So you did mention in your article too about testing strings for manufacturers. So So I'm assuming Technofiber, and do you also get to do that with Ashaway, or is it other companies as well? Or
Yes, it's a little bit with Ashaway, not so much. I mean, with Technofiber, I do a lot of testing with Technofiber, with Caracal, with Unsquashable. I'm not sure if you know Jahangir Khan. So Jahangir Khan he's the greatest ever squash player. So he was the number one back in the 70s and 80s, and he won 555 matches straight without losing. And
Wow.
the time he lost, he had a cold. Apparently had a cold, but anyway, he lost to a better man on the day, and then he won the next 200 matches straight as well. I mean, the guy was unstoppable. But his company, the company that he used, was Unsquashable for his rackets. So he was sponsored by them, and in the last 4 or 5 years, Unsquashable have made a bit of a comeback. So I've worked with Unsquashable on their strings. Caracal, who are a really great company. They're a lovely company. They're a UK-based company, and they supply a lot of professional players at the moment, including some of the players in the top 10 and top 20 in the world in women's and men's squash. And I suggested to Caracal a few months ago with one of the latest strings I was testing that they should get it coloured pink with black flecks on it, because it would be String Doctor colours. And I was kind of only joking. And then about a week or two ago, they actually sent me a reel of string which they'd had done in pink with black flecks on it in String Doctor colours. So those types of things are really, really cool. But with Ashaway, I've had access to testing strings before they're to be released, but without any real input as to what the finished product is going to feel like. But certainly with Technofiber, which is the biggest in squash, with Technofiber and Caracal, I've been quite a major part in the design process and the strings, certainly from a testing perspective anyway.
Wow. Well, and so I guess you mentioned that you have players that send you the rackets for you to string. Is there also customizing that happens with squash rackets like it does with tennis, like as far as the pallets and the weight and the balance and so forth?
Yeah, so this is another thing which I'm trying to change within squash a little bit. So players are very conscious how a racket feels, but squash players often don't know that there's that much you can do to a racket to really change it. So there are a few squash players at the top of the game who do actively get their rackets adjusted. Mohammed will actually have his rackets fully matched and spec'd by Technofiber's head office. So he'll have them all done at Technofiber, and I check them for him, and they're all bang on. They're all where they should be. But there'll be other players who send me rackets, and there'll be 10 grams difference between 3 rackets. And in squash, that's huge, because the rackets in squash typically weigh, frame weight would be about 120 to 130 grams. Whereas in tennis, it's sort of anywhere between 280 to 350, 370 is quite typical in tennis. So when you've got a 10 gram difference in a squash between squash rackets, that's big, that's huge. So
what do you use? What unit to measure it?
So I use, in terms of weight or in terms of,
yeah, if you're what do you use to test the swing weight?
So I've got a Dunlop swing weight machine.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is I think most of or a lot of the manufacturers at the moment use a fairly similar type of machine. I think it's fairly similar to the Alpha one as well. Mm-hmm. So I've got a Dunlop swing weight machine, which is pretty standard. It's pretty bulletproof. Balance boards. I've got obviously my Wilson machine, but I also use a tuner. So I've got one of these Pro T1 tuners. I'm not sure if you can.
Yep, I can see that. Yep.
So these things are actually pretty cool. It's a string tuner, so it's taken over from the old ERTs that I think Beers
right. Those aren't around anymore, and people are like, wanting those to come back and stuff. So is that device that you have right there, is that available still, or is that also one that's no longer on the market?
No, they're still being made. So it's a company in Italy that make them. They're not cheap.
What is it called?
It's the Pro T1.
And what is that? That is for the
So that's for
Tension?
string. That's for string tuning. So
String tuning.
so it's chromatic. So it's a chromatic tuner. So it does it by the sound of the strings as you tap the strings.
Yeah, I have an app for that now that I use that works pretty good. It's like the harmonics. It listens
Oh,
to the pitch.
Racket tune.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I used Racket tune. I thought that was pretty cool, but it wasn't so good for squash or
Well, I
badminton.
use a tennis tension, it's called.
Oh, okay.
It's like this. You put in, the head size, the pattern, the
Yeah.
spring material, it listens to the pitch and the tone. It seems to work a bit.
Yeah, they're pretty useful actually, I think. And I think even if it's very difficult to actually gauge the true tension of a squash or a tennis racket after you've strung them. It is all you can say is my machine is calibrated. I've strung this racket at 30 pounds, 25 pounds, whatever it might be. That's all you can say. But you get one of these tuners and you can say, well, the dynamic tension of this, of the string bed is 25 pounds or 30 pounds or so on and so forth.
Right.
And if you have 3 or 4 rackets to string, and you guys will know this, you get 3 or 4 rackets identical to string in exactly the same way with the same string for one player, you do them all straight away. So you do them all within 2 hours of each other, rather than doing them over the course of a week.
Yeah.
And so I'll use that tuning device there to test the dynamic tension after the first racket, put it to one side, string the next racket, then test it. So I'm testing each racket after I've strung them, rather than waiting until after I've strung all of them.
Yeah,
So I get a true dynamic tension.
Exactly.
And that's something which isn't that common in squash at the moment. There aren't too many squash stringers, certainly that I know of, who will have swing weight machines, balance boards, tuners.
I don't think it's common in tennis either, unless you're at tournaments and stuff. But I don't know any clients who ever hear of that until I tell them about it, because I do it for all my clients the second it comes off the machine. And if they don't pick it up till the next day, I check it again before I give it to them. And the polyesters can lose 2 to 3 pounds overnight just sitting there.
Yeah.
And they could be 12, 15 pounds looser 3 weeks later. So, and the clients I have are really appreciating learning and understanding more about that. And Pat and I have talked about it a lot.
Yeah, and as long as we realize that it's a reference number, it's not supposed to tell us this is exactly what the tension, because what is, it's all relevant to whatever you're doing. So as long as you have a reference number that later on you can go back to and go, oh, well, it's 20% lower than it was a week ago. Oh, it's 30% lower. Then it gives you, and at some point you make a decision when it hits 40 or whatever, that's when I'm going to restring or whatever. So
completely. And that's what it's for. It's to see the actual drop, not necessarily what the starting point or the finish point is. It's actually just recognizing that you have 3 rackets that you've just strung, or 4 rackets that you've just strung, and every single one of them measures the same. So you know that there's consistency. And I think that's what separates a good stringer or a top stringer from an average or bad stringer or poor stringer. And that's consistency. And I'll always say that any half decent stringer can string a racket and get the pattern right, or get it so it feels nice when you tap it. But the mark of a really good stringer is being given 4 rackets, identical rackets, to string identically for somebody, and every single racket pings the same. That and also there's the whole speed thing. So people talk about should there be a time limit? Does it make you a good stringer if you string really fast? Does it make you a bad stringer if you string really slowly? And I think there's an element of yes in both, really. So I think a good stringer will, in squash and tennis, I'm relatively similar times in both. I think a good stringer in squash or tennis, 15 to 25 minutes will be a fairly good time period to string within. If you're stringing comfortably, so not rushing things through and making mistakes. So to comfortably string a racket within 15 to 25 minutes, I think is pretty strong. I think that's good.
Yeah.
I think anything too much over half an hour or so to string a racket, especially if you deem yourself to be a professional, I think you might be in the realms of saying, well, by the time you've actually got to the last cross on the racket, you might already have tension creep coming in. So by the time you've tied it off, things might go awry. And if you're taking 35, 40 minutes to string one racket and the next racket takes you 50 minutes to string because you've been distracted by something, then they're going to feel different, regardless of how good your machine or your tools are.
Yeah.
So that's something which again, another piece of advice I'd always give to any stringer is string within your capabilities, within your comfort zone, but just make sure that you're not doing things differently on each racket. So if you're going to, on the layovers, if you're going to go over on one, make sure you go over on all of them.
Yeah.
You know, don't have three rackets that look completely different.
Yeah,
Let me ask both of you.
Oh, sorry. Let me just interject real quick on that. But yeah, I think that tip is huge because, you know, we're always like, you know, when I'm talking about getting people to do just little things like always have the butt cap up when you're stringing, always start the short side on the same side.
Yeah.
Always pull the same amount of strings on each side. Always tie off at the same places when you're doing a consecutive row of rackets that are for the same player. And like I think it speaks to what you're saying. A lot of times stringers don't quite understand why is that important? You know, why do I need to do that? Nobody cares. But later on, if you want to get to that point where you want to be able to string at a tournament, you do need to care and you know, build the correct habits, because it's harder to break bad habits later on. Because at tournaments, you're always going to go to your what you know and what you generally use, because you could learn something new and you can understand that that's the way I should be doing it. But when you get in a tournament situation and you've got 20 rackets sitting there and you have a timeline, you're going to go to your whatever you know. And if that's a bad habit, that's going to be bad.
Yeah, no, good point.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Definitely. I mean, I had one guy send me 36 rackets recently. So
that was a great photo.
Oh, you saw the photo
you posted. That was great.
So he's a professional player. Him and his brother are professional squash players. And one of them was playing at a tournament where I was stringing, and he gave me 5 rackets to string on the day for him before the tournament started, just so he had rackets to play with. And he had 31 other rackets, which he'd just broken the strings and thrown his rackets under the bed. You know, use them 2 or 3 times, break the strings, throw the racket under the bed. And his mum, he's only 19, 20, 21 years old. He's just finished college, I think. And his mum contacted me and said, I've had enough. Can I give you these rackets to string? Over the last 12 months, he's just thrown his rackets under the bed. Can I give you these rackets to string? So I made a point with all of these rackets. I made a point of making sure that every single one of these rackets, every layover, every tie off, everything was exactly the same. Just because I thought, do you know what? If he's going to look at them all, I want him to look at these rackets and think they've been strung by somebody that really cares about what they're doing. And I know in tennis, that's something which I've really got from tennis, actually. In tennis, it's the really small things that make a difference. Because you don't have so many patterns in tennis, the string patterns all look very, very similar. The one thing that tennis you have to do is you have to differentiate yourself in tennis stringing by doing the small things very, very well, because the small things make a big, big difference.
Yeah.
And that's something which I've definitely learned from tennis, which I think a lot of squash stringers may not do. But the likes of Nick Down, and there's another stringer called Liam Nolan, who's also a really good stringer. These guys will have that same attention to detail as I do. So,
awesome.
But they do a lot of tennis. I mean, Liam has strung at Wimbledon on several occasions as well. I think there might even be a video of him somewhere doing a world record attempt. So these are top squash stringers that also do a lot of tennis stringing. And the one common denominator is that they've taken the good stuff from tennis and applied it to squash.
Awesome. Let me ask you guys both one question. I know we're running over time, and I'm going to have to pick my son up pretty soon. But I want to ask you both this question. Pat, I don't think we've talked about it, and I've thought about it a few times because I do pay attention to dynamic tension or actual tension, whatever you call it. You know, when you remove the racket after stringing it, you pull the string, that's considered the reference tension. But when it's all done, you take the racket off, you're now left with the dynamic or actual tension. So what if you have the exact same racket, but one is new off the shelf and one has been used for 10 months now, beat up, the grommets are more worn, the bumper guards are more warm? Might that affect the actual tension if you're stringing it with the same string, same tension? Because one is a brand new racket, it hasn't been beat up, the flex might be slightly different. Have you ever talked about that or had an opinion on that?
So that's a really, really good point, actually. I don't mind if, Pat, if you want to answer that first, but it's a really good question.
Well, from, I'm not a, I've never worked for a racket manufacturer. I've never worked in actually making rackets. So for me, my perspective is just from, what I know from stringing all these years and from what people tell me, and, it different and what I've experienced as well. And, there is a life cycle to a racket, right? I mean, a racket does not last forever. They break down pretty quickly. Same with like strings, they break down, right? So rackets break down too. But, if you remember back in the 70s or, when they had aluminum rackets, a lot of those, when they were making them, they knew how many, they knew based on that steel and based on that aluminum, how many times it should last to some degree. I mean, sometimes some of those frames would only last 100 hours of hitting or less or whatever, and so there's a life to that. So I would assume that in today's market, of course, materials have gotten to be a lot stronger, a lot lighter, and that's what we're always striving for, right? But they do break down, and that's why players tend to use frames for a year or for 6 months and then get a new batch of rackets, because they can tell the difference of those rackets, because the feel is completely different, after they've been strung that amount of times. Because every time we pull a string, we're putting 50, 60 pounds of pressure on that frame. And that's why we also make sure that when a string breaks, we try to cut out the whole string right away, so that it doesn't create any additional damage. And we've seen, pulling strings the wrong way, or not having the anchor points on the stringing machine on the mounting system anchored, and you can see how the racket deforms instantly like that if you don't do it right. And so, yes, I would say that it is going to make a difference. I think you would end up with a different number on a racket that's 3 years old versus one that's crisp, brand new, that has never been strung. And so that creates a whole different problem. But I think on tour with those players, a lot of times they will have a reference number, or they will have some kind of indication on the frame of when they started using that racket. And so they know when it's time to recycle that. So for them, they're going to be referencing the same batch of rackets probably, or something similar, when they say, oh, this feels a little bit different than that one. Those two really should feel the same, because they probably came from the same batch, or at least from the same run of rackets that they're using. But for a recreational player, it could be completely different. So I think we need to make sure we educate our customers on that. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I would pretty much agree with what you're saying there, Pat. I mean, what I would probably expect is straight away, if I had two identical rackets, but one is 12 months old and one is brand new, straight off the shelf, stringing them identically, I'd probably expect them straight away for the first few hours to ping the same. But I think because one of the frames has probably been softened up a bit and taken a bit more of a hammering over that 12 months, I'd expect to probably see a bit more tension drop off that frame quicker than the other one. I think it's only natural. I think it would only be for a very short space of time that you would have the same dynamic tension. And the same, I guess, applies with squash, tennis, with any rackets, really. I mean, with squash, you'd be lucky to have a decent player where a squash racket lasts for more than 12 months anyway. They get hit on the wall a lot more. A lot more. Mind you, having said that, squash players don't tend to break rackets over their legs as much as or around posts or or the side which tennis players do. So I've yet to see a squash equivalent of Goran Ivanisevic smashing all 5 remaining rackets so he can't continue a match. That I don't think that's happened in squash just yet.
So it sounds like, so what you are saying is that right after you string the racket, you should be able to get a reference number that's similar so that you can at least know I strung this the same way that I strung the other one. And then if one drops off considerably, then you know, hey, this might be also a time to maybe look at changing this racket out because it is not performing like your other one. So you could actually get some more information, valuable information than just that initial reference number.
Or
Yeah.
vice versa, if 3 are brand new and 1 is old, and the 3 stack up dead on, and the 1 is giving you an actual tension of 2-3 pounds looser when it comes out the machine, then you know they're right away too.
Yeah, and there haven't been too many rackets which have been 12 months or less where I've really seen that with.
Yeah.
I think you're probably looking at a frame which drops off very quickly is probably one that is past the point of no return. It's probably a frame that is broken, is cracked. There is something wrong with it. I think if a frame itself, if it's still pretty intact and looks in quite good condition, then it should be okay. But you just don't know what happened in tennis more than anything. You just don't know if that racket is being left on top of a bag in 100 degrees sunlight compared to one that's been in a warehouse in, room temperature for a long period of time. It makes a big difference.
Yeah, exactly. This has been really fun and informative, having this chat and stuff. I love having these, having new folks on that we can ask questions and you all the information that you provided is a lot of new information for me, and your wealth of knowledge over there. And initially I think we were planning on a half an hour stream, but it never happens. We always go overtime no matter what we do. We could sit here for hours and talk, but I think I have a place I have to go off to. I think Brad has to leave, and I don't want to take extra time from you either, John. But this has been kind of fun. There's a lot of questions that I didn't really get to ask, and we didn't really talk much about equipment and stringing machines. But I see you've got the Bayardo in the background. We both of us have one. I'm jealous now because I just saw the Roland Garros orange Wilson machine. That orange
beautiful.
One. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. I wish I would have waited and gotten one of those instead. But
I just keep telling myself that I bet that machine chips really badly. I bet it looks terrible when it chips.
Yeah. And John helped me with my Bayardo, so I got to thank John. I thanked him, privately, but John helped kind of consult me with my purchase. So he and Herb really helped me.
It's a great machine. I used it at at the U.S. Open and in Australia when they were first introducing it. So we got to be part of that initial test run back in 08, 07. I think it was 08. Yeah. But there's just not, at that time, there just wasn't a lot of tournament stringing machines around, because a lot of people were transitioning from the Babolat Star 4s, Star 5s, and sensors and so forth. And so, the Wilson definitely has made a great run there. But now we've got lots of other machines out there too, Head's machine, the new one that they're working on, and there's a lot of great equipment out there these days.
Solinko's coming out with one. Yonex has some great ones.
Yeah, Yonex has some great ones and stuff. So, but yeah, we could talk hours on this stuff, and hopefully if you're willing, John, in the future we can have you on again and just chat up, and you can help us with some of those things. I'll make sure I reference your YouTube channel, and it sounds like you can really help people if they're interested in the squash side of things, and we'll definitely be watching some of that as well.
Yeah, for sure.
I think you might have hit mute.
Yep, I think John was.
We lost.
Sorry, can you
audio.
There you go.
Hear me?
Yeah. Yep, we can hear you now.
Yep. Oh, I think we lost him.
Nope,
oh, there you are, John. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
We may have lost him, but anyway, It was great. I'm gonna have to watch this again because he said a lot of things, and I don't know if I was able to absorb it all. So, but
yeah, that was
really
great.
Great stuff. So that
Yeah.
was really helpful, and he's got his pulse right on,
Oh,
the world of squash. So
oh, here he came back on. I think
okay,
had the wrong button there, but
Yeah,
perfect.
I think it was because I've got a tennis player who's waiting outside for me
Oh,
for me to pick up two of his rackets. He's got
okay.
he's got a Blade and a Prince Tour that he wants me to test out some Hyper G at very low tensions with. So right on cue.
perfect.
All right. Well, I guess we'll end it with that. So yeah, thanks, John, and hopefully we can do this again. I know we're all in different parts of the country, but it's great getting together.
Yeah, we got Hawaii, New York, and England.
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. I know where I'd rather be at the moment.
Yeah, we'd both rather be in Hawaii. That's for sure.
That's right. You could still go in the water and have fun, but yeah.
See you, Pat.
Right.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Brad.
Aloha.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks. That was perfect timing. I got to go get my son. You probably got to go to work, and